Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. During the Second World War, nearly every nation occupied by the Axis produced underground movements dedicated to liberation, but few ever threatened German control in a meaningful way. Rail lines were sabotaged, collaborators assassinated, and intelligence leaked to the Allies, yet in most cases, these efforts remained peripheral to the war's outcome. In Yugoslavia, something profoundly different occurred. Something so effective that it defied every assumption about what a resistance movement could achieve. What began as a scattered collection of guerrilla bands, divided by ideology, ethnicity, and geography, was slowly forged into a force capable of confronting the Third Reich in open battle. By the war's end, Yugoslav partisans controlled vast territories, fielded hundreds of thousands of fighters, and liberated their country largely by their own hand. The arrival of the Red Army in 1945 would deliver the final blow, but German rule had already been fatally undermined long before Soviet tanks crossed the border. This achievement becomes even more remarkable when placed against Yugoslavia's starting position. Few countries in Europe were as internally fractured or as geopolitically exposed. Its population was divided among Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, Montenegrins, Macedonians, and numerous minorities, many separated not just by language, but by religion, historical grievances, and incompatible political vision. In most occupied nations, unity was hard-won. In Yugoslavia, unity seemed almost impossible. And yet, it was precisely within this chaos that the most powerful resistance movement in occupied Europe emerged. While other underground groups struggled with communication, coordination, and legitimacy, the Yugoslav partisans overcame each in turn, transforming internal division into strategic strength. They did not merely survive Axis repression, they expanded because of it, growing stronger as occupation grew more brutal. At the center of this transformation stood a man few had heard of before the war, a communist organizer named Josip Broz Tito. He did not inherit a unified army, nor did he command universal loyalty. What he possessed instead was a ruthless understanding of power, timing, and human fear, coupled with an ability to exploit the occupiers' own policies against them. His rise would reshape Yugoslavia and leave scars that would endure long after the last shots were fired. To understand how Yugoslavia produced a resistance unlike any other, one must begin not with Tito, but with the country itself. A state born fragile, governed awkwardly, and held together by little more than exhaustion from the last war, Yugoslavia entered the 1940s already balanced on the edge of collapse. When the Axis finally pushed, it did not merely invade a country, it shattered one. Long before German bombers appeared over Belgrade, Yugoslavia was a country struggling to justify its own existence. Born from the wreckage of empires after the First World War, it was less a unified nation than a forced marriage of peoples with little shared history of cooperation. Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Macedonians, Montenegrins, and others were bound together by borders drawn in European conference rooms rather than by common identity. Religion hardened these divisions further. Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats and Slovenes, and Muslim Bosniaks lived side by side, carrying memories of past violence and imperial rule under Ottomans and Habsburgs. Language alone could not bridge these gaps, and even the idea of a single Yugoslav language was contested. Loyalty flowed first to village, church, and ethnic group, not to the distant state in Belgrade. Politically, Yugoslavia staggered from crisis to crisis. Parliamentary democracy proved fragile, paralyzed by ethnic rivalries and regional interests. By the late 1920s, the system collapsed entirely, replaced by royal dictatorship in a desperate attempt to impose unity from above. Stability came at the cost of legitimacy, and resentment only deepened beneath the surface. Economically, the country lagged far behind Western Europe. Much of the population lived in rural poverty, dependent on subsistence farming, with limited industry and poor infrastructure. The Great Depression struck Yugoslavia hard, hollowing out what little economic cohesion existed and leaving large portions of the population desperate and disillusioned. Strategically, Yugoslavia's position was disastrous. It shared borders with Germany and Italy, while Hungary and Bulgaria eyed its territory with open hostility. Surrounded by hostile or revisionist powers, Yugoslavia possessed neither the military strength nor the internal unity to defend itself. By the eve of the Second World War, it was a state held together by inertia alone, waiting for the moment when pressure from outside would expose the fractures within. By the late 1930s, Yugoslavia's fragile balance rested in the hands of Prince Paul, acting as regent for his underage cousin, King Peter II. Paul was cultured, intelligent, and deeply aware of Yugoslavia's weaknesses, but he governed a country whose problems no single man could solve. The military was underfunded and outdated, the economy stagnant, and the political class divided along ethnic lines that no decree could erase. Paul himself was no fascist sympathizer. He admired Britain, spent much of his time there, and hoped Yugoslavia might survive the gathering storm through neutrality. Yet neutrality demanded strength, and Yugoslavia possessed none. German economic influence seeped steadily into the country, while pro-Axis fifth columns in Croatia and Slovenia worked quietly to undermine the state from within. Each concession Paul made to preserve stability only inflamed resentment elsewhere, particularly among the Serbian officer corps, who viewed compromise as betrayal. As Hitler's victories reshaped Europe, pressure mounted. Italy loomed from the west, Germany from the north, Hungary and Bulgaria watched from the east, and Yugoslavia stood isolated at the center. By early 1941, Paul faced a brutal reality. Resistance meant destruction, while appeasement offered at least the illusion of survival. With no credible military deterrent and no immediate Allied support, the choice was agonizing but clear. On March 25, 1941, Prince Paul signed the tripartite pact, formally aligning Yugoslavia with the Axis. Though the agreement preserved nominal sovereignty, it was widely seen as capitulation. In Belgrade's cafes and barracks alike, anger boiled over. For many, the pact confirmed what they had long feared, that Yugoslavia's leaders were sacrificing national honor in exchange for temporary safety. Within days, that anger would erupt into action, sealing the country's fate. The signing of the tripartite pact triggered an explosion of fury within Yugoslavia's military, particularly among its Serbian-dominated officer corps. To them, Prince Paul's decision was not a pragmatic compromise, but an act of submission that erased the sacrifices of the First World War. In the early hours of March 27, 1941, officers moved swiftly, seizing key positions in Belgrade and overthrowing the regency in a near-bloodless coup. The plotters placed the 17-year-old King Peter II on the throne, proclaiming Yugoslavia's rejection of Axis domination. Crowds flooded the streets, waving flags and chanting slogans in support of the young king. For a brief moment, it seemed as though national unity had been restored through defiance, as if courage alone might shield the country from what was coming. But the jubilation masked a grim reality. Yugoslavia was now completely encircled by Axis powers, its army unprepared and its diplomatic position catastrophic. The new government immediately sought Allied support, opening desperate negotiations with Britain in the hope of deterring German aggression. No meaningful guarantees arrived. The coup had changed Yugoslavia's posture, but not its strategic reality. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler reacted with personal rage. He saw the coup not as a political shift, but as a betrayal and an insult, a challenge to his authority at a moment when he was preparing the greatest campaign of his life against the Soviet Union. Almost immediately, he ordered Yugoslavia's destruction as a state. Plans were drawn up with ruthless speed, and the country's fate was sealed not by its enemy's strength alone, but by the timing of its defiance. In the early hours of April 6, 1941, the illusion of Yugoslav defiance was shattered from the sky. Without a declaration of war, the Luftwaffe unleashed massive bombing raids against Yugoslavia's airfields and the capital city of Belgrade. Waves of German aircraft reduced government buildings, rail hubs, and civilian neighborhoods to rubble, killing thousands in a matter of hours. The city burned as communications collapsed, and with them any hope of coordinated defense. Almost simultaneously, Axis armies surged across Yugoslavia's borders from every direction. German forces poured in from Austria and Hungary, while the Second Army, supported by the 12th Army and the 1st Panzer Group, drove relentlessly toward the country's heart. Italy joined the assault from the west and south, and within days Hungary followed, eager to claim its share of the spoils. Yugoslavia now faced invasion on 5 separate fronts, an impossible situation for any army, let alone one crippled by neglect and division. The Royal Yugoslav Army barely had time to mobilize. Units were scattered, poorly equipped, and armed with obsolete weapons sourced from a dozen different nations. Ethnic tensions further undermined cohesion as desertion spread and some units simply disintegrated under pressure. Only in Albania did Yugoslav troops manage a fleeting success against Italian forces. Everywhere else, resistance collapsed with alarming speed. By April 13th, German troops entered Belgrade. 5 days later, on April 18th, Yugoslavia signed an unconditional surrender. The campaign had lasted just 12 days, costing the Axis only a few thousand casualties while yielding more than 200,000 Yugoslav prisoners of war. King Peter II fled into exile, finding refuge with the British, never to return to the country he had briefly ruled. Yugoslavia, as a sovereign state, ceased to exist, destroyed not slowly, but almost overnight. With the surrender signed and the king in exile, Yugoslavia vanished from the map almost as quickly as it had been created. Hitler made good on his promise to destroy the state entirely, carving its territory into occupation zones and puppet regimes designed to exploit ethnic divisions rather than heal them. What followed was not simply military occupation, but the deliberate fragmentation of a society already strained to its limits. Serbia was placed under direct German military administration, ruled through collaborationist authorities, and subjected to harsh reprisals intended to keep the population in check. Croatia, meanwhile, was transformed into the so-called independent state of Croatia, a fascist puppet under Ante Pavelić, whose regime owed its survival entirely to German and Italian support. In the west, Italy annexed Ljubljana and much of the Dalmatian coast, while Hungary and Bulgaria seized border regions they had long coveted. Yugoslavia's dismemberment followed ethnic lines where convenient, and strategic ones where it did not, ensuring permanent instability. The new borders inflamed old hatreds and created new ones. Communities that had once lived under a single state now found themselves on opposite sides of occupation zones, subject to radically different policies and levels of brutality. Collaboration, resistance, and show trials became facts of daily life, and the violence of the occupiers soon dwarfed the chaos of the invasion itself. Yet even as Axis flags were raised and administrations installed, resistance began almost immediately. The ink on the surrender documents had barely dried before survivors of the Royal Yugoslav Army fled into the mountains of Serbia and Bosnia. There, in forests and highlands beyond the reach of occupying patrols, the first armed groups began to organize. Among them was a former officer named Draza Mihailović, who would soon emerge as the leader of one of Yugoslavia's earliest resistance movements. In the remote mountains of western Serbia, Colonel Draza Mihailović began gathering the remnants of the shattered Royal Yugoslav Army. His vision was conservative and monarchist: preserve what remained of the old state, wait for Allied intervention, and strike only when victory was assured. These fighters saw themselves not as rebels, but as soldiers of a government temporarily driven into exile. Over time, they became known as the Chetniks, a name drawn from older Serbian guerrilla traditions, heavy with nationalist symbolism. At the same time, a very different resistance was taking shape. Josip Broz Tito, a communist organizer with experience in underground politics, saw the Axis invasion not as a catastrophe, but as an opportunity. To Tito, the collapse of Yugoslavia's old order created the conditions for something entirely new, a socialist federation born through armed struggle. His partisans rejected waiting and compromise, choosing instead immediate confrontation with the occupiers. From the beginning, the two movements were divided by more than ideology. Mihailović feared German reprisals and prioritized protecting Serbian civilians, even if that meant avoiding direct attacks. Tito believed violence was unavoidable, and that escalation favored the insurgent, not the occupier. Where the Chetniks sought restoration, the Partisans sought revolution. Cooperation between them was tentative and strained, rooted in necessity rather than trust. This dual resistance would shape everything that followed. Yugoslavia's fight against occupation was never a single unified struggle, but a tangled war within a war, against the Axis, against collaborationist regimes, and ultimately against each other. As the occupiers tightened their grip, The question was no longer whether Yugoslavia would resist, but which vision of Yugoslavia would survive the war. While resistance movements were still finding their footing, the Axis puppet regime in Croatia moved with terrifying speed. Under Ante Pavelić, the new state was not content to rule, it sought to cleanse. Almost immediately, all political opposition was outlawed, emergency courts established, and death sentences authorized for crimes so broadly defined that survival itself became suspect. The Ustaše, Pavelić's ultranationalist militia, were unleashed as both police and executioners. Their targets were clear: Serbs, Jews, Roma, and anyone deemed insufficiently loyal to the fascist vision were marked for elimination. Villages were erased, churches burned, and families butchered with a brutality that shocked even German officers. Camps such as Jasenovac became synonymous with sadism, where killing was industrial in intent but personal in execution. Estimates of the dead would later range into the hundreds of thousands, numbers so vast they threatened to lose meaning. Yet each death carried its own terror. This campaign of genocide did more than devastate communities. It transformed the political landscape of resistance. For many Yugoslavs, neutrality became impossible. The occupiers and their collaborators had made survival contingent on choosing sides. Where fear ruled, flight followed, into forests, mountains, and the ranks of armed groups that promised protection or revenge. For Tito, the Ustaš terror was a grim advantage. Every massacre drove new recruits toward the Partisans, not because of ideology, but because they offered the only organized force willing to fight back without conditions. The violence intended to pacify the population instead radicalized it, turning genocide into the most powerful recruiting tool the resistance could have imagined. As German occupation hardened, the rules of war in Yugoslavia became mercilessly clear. In response to insurgent attacks, the Wehrmacht issued a policy of collective punishment. 100 civilians would be executed for every German soldier killed, 50 for every wounded. The decree was meant to suffocate resistance through terror, to make the cost of rebellion unbearable. Instead, it gave Tito a weapon more powerful than any rifle. Tito understood something his enemies did not, that fear could be redirected. After successful raids, his fighters would return to nearby villages and deliver a stark ultimatum. Civilians could join the partisans immediately, taking up arms and fleeing into the hills, or they could remain behind and wait for the inevitable reprisal squads. In a land already scarred by genocide and occupation, this was not a theoretical choice. Entire villages emptied overnight, swelling partisan ranks not through persuasion, but through survival. This ruthless logic worked. By late 1941, the Partisans had grown from scattered bands into a coherent force capable of holding territory. In western Serbia, they liberated the town of Užice, declaring it the center of a revolutionary enclave. Factories were repurposed to produce ammunition, newspapers spread propaganda, and a shadow government briefly took shape. It was the first tangible proof that resistance could do more than harass. It could rule. Yet even in victory, cracks appeared. Mihailovic's Chetniks had participated in the liberation, but they recoiled at Tito's methods and ideology. Where the partisans saw necessity, the royalists saw catastrophe. German reprisals intensified, and cooperation between the two movements rapidly collapsed. The Republic of Užice would soon fall, but its brief existence marked a turning point. Yugoslavia's resistance had crossed a threshold, and there would be no return to cautious waiting. The Republic of Užice did not last long, but its collapse revealed the true nature of Yugoslavia's war. Before German columns even reached the region, the fragile alliance between Tito and Mihailovic had already unraveled. Ideology, strategy, and fear collided, and cooperation gave way to suspicion. For the Chetniks, the partisans' aggressive tactics invited annihilation. For Tito, hesitation meant irrelevance. When German forces moved to retake Užice in late 1941, they found not a unified resistance, but a divided one. A civil war had ignited inside the occupation itself. Partisan units withdrew under pressure, slipping back into the forests of Bosnia, while Chetnik formations avoided direct confrontation and focused on preserving their strength. The Germans crushed the enclave with ease, proving that territory without unity could not be held. In the aftermath, the divergence became irreversible. Mihailović sought legitimacy from the Yugoslav government in exile and recognition from the Western allies, convinced that the war would be decided by conventional armies, not guerrillas. Tito, by contrast, embraced constant movement, decentralization, and political indoctrination, transforming defeat into a lesson rather than a catastrophe. The fall of Užice marked the end of any illusion of a single resistance. From this point forward, Yugoslavia's war would be fought on three fronts at once: against the Axis occupiers, against collaborationist regimes, and against rival visions of the country's future. The struggle for liberation had become inseparable from a struggle for power. After the fall of Užice, Draža Mihailović faced a narrowing set of options. Praised by Allied radio broadcasts as a heroic resistance leader, he nonetheless received little material support, leaving his forces ill-equipped and strategically paralyzed. Convinced that Germany would ultimately be defeated by Allied armies rather than insurgents, Mihailović chose patience over confrontation, believing survival mattered more than symbolic resistance. This caution soon crossed into compromise. Seeking to shield Serbian civilians from brutal reprisals, Chetnik commanders opened quiet channels with Axis authorities and collaborationist regimes, coordinating ceasefires and even joint actions against Tito's partisans. What began as tactical accommodation hardened into collaboration, eroding whatever moral authority the Chetniks still possessed. To many Yugoslavs, the distinction between occupier and supposed protector became increasingly blurred. Allied intelligence slowly pieced together the reality on the ground. Reports revealed that while Chetnik units avoided fighting Germans, they devoted growing energy to suppressing communist rivals and engaging in ethnic violence of their own. The resistance movement, once celebrated in London, was losing its legitimacy at home, replaced by a reputation for passivity and betrayal. By contrast, Tito's forces continued to expand, drawing strength from action rather than promises. As Mihailovic's strategy collapsed under the weight of its contradictions, the moral center of Yugoslavia's resistance shifted decisively. The question was no longer which movement claimed loyalty to the old state, but which one was actually fighting to liberate the country. While the Chetniks hesitated, Tito moved without pause. The launch of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 drained German forces from Yugoslavia, pulling experienced divisions eastward toward the Soviet Union. Tito recognized the opening immediately. Where others saw chaos, he saw space, and he ordered a general expansion of partisan operations across Bosnia, Montenegro, and Croatia, turning scattered resistance into a coordinated war effort. The partisans possessed advantages their rivals did not. At their core were veterans of the Spanish Civil War, men and women hardened by ideological struggle and modern combat, who understood guerrilla warfare as discipline, logistics, and morale rather than simple ambush. Training was relentless, command structures flexible, and political education embedded directly into military life, binding fighters together across ethnic and regional lines. Crucially, the partisans were different not only in how they fought, but in who was allowed to fight. Unlike rival movements, they openly recruited women as combatants, medics, couriers, and political organizers, integrating them fully into frontline units and command structures. This was not symbolism, but necessity, and it reinforced the movement's character as a social revolution as much as a military one. Above all, the occupiers themselves fed the insurgency. German reprisals, Italian brutality, and Ustasha genocide erased any remaining space for neutrality. Villagers who might once have avoided politics now faced extermination for doing nothing at all. In this environment, the partisans became not merely a fighting force, but a refuge, absorbing Serbs fleeing Ustasha terror, Croats escaping fascist rule, Bosniaks caught between rival militias, and anyone else the occupation had marked for death. By the end of 1942, Tito's movement had evolved into an army in all but name. It maneuvered in brigades, coordinated across regions, and fought sustained engagements against Axis formations. Yugoslavia was no longer facing scattered insurgents, but a revolutionary war that was beginning to consume the occupiers themselves. By early 1943, the German High Command concluded that Yugoslavia's insurgency had grown too large to be managed through reprisals alone. What followed was Case White, a massive, coordinated offensive intended to encircle and annihilate Tito's partisans in Bosnia. More than 90,000 German and Italian troops, supported by as many as 15,000 Chetnik collaborators, converged on partisan-held territory with overwhelming artillery, armor, and air power. Opposing them were roughly 20,000 partisans, burdened not only with fighting, but with thousands of wounded, civilians, and refugees moving alongside their columns. As the Axis advance tightened, Tito ordered a fighting withdrawal, trading land for time and cohesion. Losses mounted rapidly, yet the core of the army remained intact, bound together by discipline and the knowledge that capture meant annihilation. The geography itself became an enemy. In the unforgiving limestone gorges of Bosnia, the land rose into sheer cliffs and narrow passes, cut by rivers swollen with snowmelt and exposed to constant aerial attack. Columns of wounded were carried on makeshift stretchers along mountain paths barely wide enough for a single file, where a misstep meant plunging into ravines below. There was no shelter from artillery echoing through the valleys, only movement or death. The crisis reached its peak at the Neretva River, where German commanders believed the partisans were finally trapped. With enemy forces closing from all sides, Tito ordered the main bridge destroyed, convincing the Axis that escape was impossible. Then, under relentless fire, he reversed the deception, secretly rebuilding the crossing just long enough to force his army across into terrain the Germans considered impassable. The breakout came at an enormous cost. Entire units were sacrificed to hold the perimeter while the wounded crossed first. Casualties were staggering, yet survival itself became victory. Case White failed not because the Axis lacked strength, but because the partisans had learned how to endure the unendurable. At Neretva, Tito's movement proved it could survive annihilation, and that knowledge would shape every battle that followed. No sooner had the partisans escaped destruction at the Neretva than the Axis launched an even more merciless assault. In the late spring of 1943, Case Black was set in motion, designed to complete what the previous offensive had failed to achieve. Nearly 120,000 German, Italian, Bulgarian, and collaborationist troops converged on partisan concentrations in eastern Bosnia and Montenegro, with explicit orders to encircle Tito's headquarters and destroy the resistance at its core. The battlefield was defined by terrain as much as by firepower. At Sutjeska, the mountains rose sharply into snow-dusted ridgelines and steep ravines, where movement slowed to a crawl and escape routes vanished overnight. Exhausted fighters dragged the wounded through freezing rivers and narrow passes, often under continuous air attack, while artillery thundered through valleys that offered nowhere to hide. Hunger, disease, and exposure claimed lives as surely as bullets. Encircled and starving, the partisans faced annihilation. Tito himself was wounded during the fighting and came perilously close to capture as German units closed in from every direction. In desperation, surviving brigades hurled themselves against the weakest points of the ring, launching repeated assaults across the Sutjeska River. Entire formations were destroyed, buying time for others to break through, while thousands of wounded were left behind, knowing what awaited them. What followed was massacre. Axis forces executed vast numbers of captured and wounded partisans and carried out retaliatory killings in nearby villages suspected of aiding the resistance. Yet even this catastrophe failed to end the movement. Those who escaped emerged shattered but alive, having endured what should have been their extinction. Sutjeska became a crucible. The partisans had crossed a threshold where defeat no longer meant collapse, only survival at unimaginable cost. From this moment forward, neither the occupiers nor the Allies could deny that Yugoslavia's resistance had been tempered into something far more dangerous than an insurgency. By late 1943, the fog surrounding Yugoslavia's resistance began to lift in London and Cairo. For years, Allied intelligence had struggled to interpret a torrent of contradictory reports, heroic claims from Chetnik radio operators, grim casualty lists from German communiques, and fragmented accounts from agents moving through an occupied, fractured land. Now, teams sent directly into Yugoslavia reached the same conclusion independently. Only one force was consistently fighting the Axis. British liaison officers embedded with both movements observed stark contrasts. Chetnik units avoided contact with German forces, negotiated local truces, and prioritized suppressing communist rivals. Tito's partisans, by contrast, attacked relentlessly, disrupted rail lines vital to German logistics, and tied down divisions that Berlin desperately needed elsewhere. The difference was no longer ideological. It was operational. One movement waited for liberation. The other was actively creating it. The shift in Allied policy was swift and decisive. Arms drops, supplies, and air support were redirected toward the partisans, while assistance to the Chetniks quietly dried up. Radio broadcasts that once praised Mihailovich now emphasized Tito's leadership. This reversal shattered the Chetniks' remaining legitimacy and confirmed what many Yugoslavs already knew. The future of resistance no longer lay with restoration, but with revolution. The consequences were immediate. With Allied backing, Tito's movement gained international recognition and material strength, transforming from an embattled insurgency into a strategic partner. Yugoslavia's war was no longer a peripheral sideshow. It had become a central front in the struggle to weaken the Axis in southeastern Europe, and Tito now stood at its center, no longer merely surviving, but shaping the outcome. The balance of power shifted dramatically in September 1943, when Italy, one of Yugoslavia's principal occupiers, secretly concluded an armistice with the Allies. Almost overnight, the Italian army in the Balkans collapsed into confusion. 17 Italian divisions found themselves stranded in hostile territory, cut off from command and facing an uncertain fate. For Tito's partisans, it was an unexpected windfall. 2 Italian divisions in Montenegro immediately switched sides, joining the Partisans rather than surrendering to German forces. Another aligned itself with Albanian insurgents, while the remaining units disintegrated, surrendering en masse or abandoning their equipment as they retreated. Weapons, ammunition, artillery, and vehicles flowed into partisan hands, transforming lightly armed guerrillas into a force capable of sustained conventional warfare. Germany responded with fury. Determined to compensate for Italy's collapse, Axis commanders launched Operation Kugelblitz, or Ball Lightning, against partisan-held territories in Croatia. The strategy was brutally simple: destroy everything, kill anyone who might support the insurgency, and leave nothing behind that could sustain resistance. Villages were burned, livestock slaughtered, and civilians executed indiscriminately, often with the assistance of Ustaše militias already steeped in genocide. Yet the violence backfired. Each atrocity drove more civilians into the forests, swelling partisan ranks beyond anything the occupiers could contain. By early 1944, Operation Kugelblitz had achieved nothing beyond radicalizing the remaining population. The partisans emerged larger, better armed, and more confident than ever before, poised to withstand whatever final measures the Germans could still bring to bear. By the spring of 1944, German commanders concluded that mass offensives had failed. If the partisans could not be destroyed, perhaps they could be decapitated. The plan that followed, Operation Russelsprung, or Knight's Move, was precise, daring, and ruthless. Its objective was simple: capture or kill Tito himself. Remove the man, and the movement would collapse. The assault centered on the Bosnian town of Drvar, where German intelligence believed the partisan headquarters was located. At dawn, elite troops of the 500th SS Parachute Battalion descended from the sky, landing directly on the town in a rare airborne strike deep behind enemy lines. Simultaneously, ground forces pushed inward from multiple directions, aiming to seal every possible escape route. For a moment, it appeared the gamble might succeed. Tito was present when the attack began. As paratroopers seized key buildings and firefights erupted in the streets, he was forced to take shelter in a nearby cave, while his guards and escort units fought desperately to hold the attackers at bay. The fighting around Drvar became chaotic and brutal, with partisan units improvising defenses against highly trained assault troops. Casualties mounted rapidly on both sides, and the outcome hung on a knife's edge. Allied air power tipped the balance. The Balkan Air Force launched repeated sorties against German positions, disrupting reinforcements and buying critical time. Under cover of the fighting, Tito slipped away, retreating through the mountains toward Kupres. Though as many as 6,000 partisans were killed in the operation, the Germans failed in their primary objective. Tito lived, and with his survival, Operation Russelsprung became the last great Axis attempt to break the Yugoslav resistance from within. The failure of Operation Russelsprung marked a turning point that could no longer be reversed. What remained of German authority in Yugoslavia was now defensive, reactive, and steadily eroding. Tito's partisans, by contrast, emerged from the battle transformed. No longer merely a resistance movement, they had become a national army in all but name, commanding territory, administering civilian life, and coordinating operations across entire regions. In the months that followed, Allied recognition followed Allied support. Tito negotiated directly with representatives of the Yugoslav government in exile, leveraging his military dominance into political legitimacy. By the summer of 1944, he was formally acknowledged as Yugoslavia's sole legitimate military leader. This recognition shattered what remained of the Chetnik movement. King Peter II, broadcasting from exile, called on all Yugoslavs to join Tito's National Liberation Army, effectively ending the royalist cause. Events on the Eastern Front now accelerated the transformation. As the Red Army advanced into the Balkans, Bulgaria switched sides, opening its borders to Soviet forces. This gave Tito direct access to heavy weapons, armor, and coordinated offensives alongside conventional armies. In October 1944, a joint Soviet-Bulgarian partisan assault liberated Belgrade, a symbolic and strategic victory that cemented Tito's dominance over eastern Yugoslavia. By winter, the partisans controlled vast swaths of the country. Their command structure resembled that of a regular state, complete with ministries, courts, and security forces. The insurgents who had once survived by ambush and retreat now planned large-scale operations, preparing not just to defeat the Axis, but to decide what Yugoslavia would become after the war. The transition from resistance to ruling power was nearly complete. As 1945 dawned, the war in Yugoslavia entered its final and most violent phase. German forces, increasingly isolated and short of supplies, clung to defensive positions along the Sirmian front, while Tito committed wave after wave of partisan units in costly frontal assaults. The fighting was brutal and grinding, revealing a decisive shift in character. The partisans were no longer insurgents seeking to avoid decisive battle, but a mass army prepared to absorb losses in order to destroy the enemy and dictate the post-war order. In the spring, collapse came rapidly. Tito's forces seized Sarajevo and dismantled what remained of the independent state of Croatia, while German formations began a chaotic retreat north and west. Even after the official Nazi surrender on May 8, 1945, the violence did not stop. At Poljana, partisan troops pursued and engaged a column of nearly 30,000 German soldiers, forcing their surrender only when British armor arrived to formalize the capitulation. Yugoslavia's war ended not with relief, but with exhaustion and bloodshed that spilled beyond the war's official close. Victory brought reckoning. Tens of thousands of defeated soldiers and civilians, Croatian fascists, collaborators, and those fleeing in fear of retribution, attempted to surrender to Western Allied forces. Instead, Allied authorities handed them back to Tito's partisans, often unknowingly sealing their fate. What followed were mass executions, forced marches, and prison camps collectively remembered as the Bleiburg repatriations, a final wave of violence that blurred the line between justice and revenge. The human cost was immense. At least 1 million Yugoslavs were dead, millions more displaced, their lives torn apart by occupation, genocide, civil war, and revolution. King Peter II would die in exile in the United States. Draža Mihailović would be captured and executed in 1946 for collaboration, and Josip Broz Tito would emerge as the unchallenged ruler of a new socialist federal republic of Yugoslavia. It would endure for nearly half a century, born in resistance, hardened by war, and forever shaped by the violence